the webinar today. If maybe we can put up the slide deck now so we can get started. And maybe while that's being put up, I just wanted to say a big thanks to all the co-authors for their contributions when developing the guide, and especially to Greg Seymour and Betsy Kostenbatter, who recently moved on to other organizations, but whose leadership and expertise were instrumental when developing the guide. Also, a special thanks to others who are in one way or another linked to this guide, and especially Rhiannon Pyburn and colleagues at KIT. And then, an extra special thanks to Dr. Lauren Pandofelli, who will provide a reflection today on the guide. And then maybe before we get started, one last point, and that you'll learn today that this guide was developed and piloted using a participatory approach. We piloted the guide in two very different country contexts and across multiple agri-food systems, and it is intended to be a guide and is not to be prescriptive in nature. So it is our hope that some of you will find the guide helpful when developing your own tools to better understand, measure, and address gender norms in agri-food systems in your country context. So maybe if we could move to the next slide, but take it off that slide mode. It's on that.
Yeah, we're seeing the, just to clarify, yeah, I explained to Mariella, we're seeing the like notes version on the side. So if you just want to show the full screen version.
Without the presentation mode, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can click on that one now.
Okay.
No.
Marilia, if you click that 3 dots right below the screen, yes. The hide presenter view. Can you try that? Or we just yeah. Hide. Okay. Just try again. If it doesn't work, we can just go ahead with that view.
I can do it from my computer if it doesn't work.
Still not working?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, Jessica, so if you want to do it, because somehow it's...
Yeah, Jessica, you should be able to do it.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, help me with one thing. Zoom has rearranged and normally use Teams. Where is my presentation mode option? Sorry. It's because I realize now it's not coming up in the place I thought it was.
Do you see the share button at the bottom of your screen?
Yeah, thank you. I was looking at the top.
All right.
All right, great.
And then head to the next slide, please.
Great, yep.
All right. All right, thanks, and sorry for that delay. So why is this guide needed, and who are its intended users? So it's relatively well known that barriers to improving gender equality and women's empowerment outcomes are often sociocultural in nature. Gender norms, which are the informal rules that govern which behaviors are appropriate within a given group, are the root cause of gender inequalities and women's disempowerment in agri-food systems. Next slide, please. The guide is intended for use by researchers and development practitioners who wish to better understand and transform gender norms in agri-food systems. The guide will help such users develop tools to collect high-quality data to measure gender norms, and as you'll see, also help inform the design of gender transformative interventions. Yet until now, no quantitative tool exists to measure and track gender norms in agri-food systems. And importantly, this guide builds on resources produced by the Joint Program on Gender Transformative Approaches that provide guidance on how to measure gender norms and gender transformative change in agri-food systems. Next slide, please. So we used a participatory approach to develop the guide. We worked with a range of different stakeholders and agri-food system actors in Tanzania and Nigeria to develop the guide. We developed a survey questionnaire using the guide, and the questionnaire was piloted in 6 different agri-food systems across the 2 focal countries. Next slide, please. So the guide is organized as follows. This kind of first part is a conceptual orientation to measuring gender norms in agri-food systems. And then we take the user through a 5-step process. And then we end with some details about how we're applying the results to date. Next slide, please. So when measuring gender norms in agri-food systems, it's important to take into account the organizational structure and work roles within agri-food systems. As most of you are aware, individuals perform different roles in agri-food systems, and these are organized and conceptualized as a value chain. Each step or node in the value chain entails carrying out different tasks, and there are normative expectations for those tasks and associated behaviors. Power dynamics too exist across the value chain that impact on normative thinking on what roles and tasks within which nodes in the value chain should be carried out by whom. Next slide, please. A second foundational layer that we consider to measuring gender norms in agri-food systems is the socio-ecological model that recognizes how individuals and their environments interact to influence behaviors and outcomes. In addition to the individual level, here in the diagram on the slide, we identified 4 additional levels in which gender norms that affect those working in agri-food systems operate and are influenced. So the household, community, organization, governance, and environment levels. Also included in the diagram are the types of gender norms that emerge through a literature review and through consultations as being most critical to the agri-food system context. These 5 norm domains include financial and material resources, technology and training, decision-making and mobility, participation and leadership, and a 5th domain on gender meta-norms. So the first 4 are relatively self-explanatory, but this 5th one on gender meta-norms needs a little bit of explanation. So meta-norms refer to influential norms that connect with deeply rooted determinants and operate at a more profound level of society and influence multiple behaviors. So we identified norms in the meta-norm domain that were likely to exist for all women in a given context, rather than just for women working in a specific agri-food system. Next slide, please. It's also important when measuring gender norms to measure both descriptive and injunctive norms. One of the references that I pointed out earlier goes into what these norms are and provides lots of examples of such norms. But put here more simply, measuring descriptive norms entails asking respondents whether a particular behavior is performed. So inquiring about what is typical, whereas measuring injunctive norms is inquiring from respondents about whether a particular behavior performed is appropriate or inappropriate. We have some examples here, and we'll go over more in a bit. So now over to Davis, who will provide an overview of the 5-step process in the guide and provide details on the first 2 steps. Over to you, Davis. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve, for that comprehensive background on the guide, and I will go directly to the next slide, please. Yeah, this figure summarizes a 5-step participatory process to develop context-specific indicators for measuring gender norms in agri-food systems. The process consists of those 5 steps, starting with stakeholder consultation, then questionnaire adaptation. We have step 3 on data collection, data analysis and indicator development, and finally the stakeholder dissemination workshop. All these steps will be described in the subsequent slides, so I won't get into details now. But overall, the process intends to help users apply the framework and concept presented in the guide, identify the gender norms in target agri-food systems, and finally develop quantitative indicators for measuring such norms. The process also provides examples for each of the steps based on the piloting of the guide in Tanzania and Nigeria. Next, please. Next slide. Yeah, step 1 on stakeholder consultation. This step involves consultation with local experts, and the aim is to use the experts' help identify specific gender norms that they perceive to be most critical for facilitating gender inequalities in the agri-food systems in which they work, but also help identify for which agri-food system actors these norms are barriers. So when inviting these stakeholders for consultation, it is important to include the representatives from the government, NGOs, universities, research institutes, and other organizations with experience working in the target agri-food systems, and those who are also knowledgeable in terms of local gender norms. Next slide. Excuse me. Yeah. Now, the guide also contains the gender norms in agri-food systems questionnaire, which is actually annexed to the guide. But this questionnaire should only be used as a template, and therefore users of the guide should adapt the questionnaire in order to fit their needs, particularly based on the insights they receive from stakeholder consultation. And here are some of the modules from the extract of the questionnaire. We have module 1 on financial and material resources, and module 2 on technologies, but also we have other modules as outlined by Dr. Steve Ko. And in all the modules, we present both the descriptive and the injunctive versions of the norm statements. Yeah, so we have both injunctive and descriptive version of each of the norms that have been included in the questionnaire. Next slide. Okay, so adapting the questionnaire aims to ensure that the process is guided by insider or emic perspectives and not simply imposed by the perspectives from outsiders, particularly the research or development project teams. And the statements that are included in the questionnaire should ensure they reflect the understanding of the people, the places, and power relations that characterize the agri-food systems. And it is also important that the questionnaire is fully translated into relevant local dialects for comprehension and for ease of understanding why or when administering the questionnaire. Next slide. All right.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Davis. Yeah, now that we're moving to data collection, firstly, it's very important to develop a strategy for sampling the women and men in each of the different roles. And these roles are going to be identified as relevant by the stakeholders during the stakeholder consultation workshop. But for example, in Tanzania and Nigeria, there were producers, processors, and traders, as well as extension officials, NGO workers, other government workers, like workers for the Ministry of Agriculture, that kind of thing. And within your sample, you're going to, or I should say, in designing your sampling strategy, you'll be identifying target groups between women and men. Again, one of those mentioned AFS roles and age range for the survey, based on whom and at what level normative change is necessary for greater gender equality and women's empowerment. So it really depends on your local context and the types of norms that you see as being the most relevant, and who those norms will be the most relevant to. So from the stakeholder workshop, from the insights that you gain from this, this is how you want to design your sampling strategy. And different approaches may be required to reach different types of actors within a specific AFS or across different agri-food systems. So this is the really important part of the stakeholder consultation, understanding what's different about or what's unique about a particular local context. This has to inform your sampling strategy. Next slide, please. I have been spotlighted. Okay, yes. So once you have collected the data, this is what we do with the data. So remember, for each norm, we have the descriptive version and the injunctive version. The descriptive version will ask something like, and I have a couple of example questions in a moment, but it'll ask something like, of the women in your community, how many do this? It could be owning a bank account. It could be operating heavy agricultural machinery, something like that. The injunctive version of the norm asks, is it acceptable for a woman to engage in this behavior? So the first is descriptive. It's asking a question about how you perceive the world around you. And the second is it's injunctive. It's, do you approve of this? Is this acceptable? So in grouping these norms in order to simplify the presentation of our findings, we recommend an indicator-based approach. So what that means is, first, we take similar norms and we group them together to form indicators. We do that using exploratory factor analysis, and the process is laid out in great detail in the paper that we'll be sharing with you at the end of this presentation. But we group the norms together using exploratory factor analysis. And now that we have norms grouped together, most of the indicators include 3 norms. We take the mean response from those norms. In our survey, we used a 5-point Likert scale. So we had options ranging from 1 to 5. So that mean response, we used a cutoff of 2.5, so right in the middle. And if you had a mean response with all those 3 norms above the cutoff, that meant that that indicated a strong norm, because as you can see, this descriptive norm indicator and the injunctive norm indicator, it's binary. Either it's strong or it's not strong on the descriptive or injunctive versions. So yeah, this cutoff assesses whether the norms related to each indicator are perceived to be restrictive to women. So using these resulting indicators, we're going to present them in a dashboard which reflects the overall prevalence of gender norms within the target agri-food system. So just if we can look at this graphic, on the left, we see all the different norms. The norms, remember, these are at the level of a survey question. So one norm is one question in the survey. When we group those together, we have an indicator, and we look at the mean response of that indicator. We apply the cutoff, so we see if the mean response is higher than the cutoff or lower than the cutoff. And at that point, we have the binary indicator of, okay, was this norm descriptively strong? Was the injunctive version of the norm strong? And then we move to the dashboard. So let's look at the next slide. Right, and feel free to stop me if there's any questions, because I know this is a lot of information. So looking at the mobility and division of labor module of the survey, I just wanted to show you what some of these questions look like. For example, the descriptive version of 1A is how many of the women you are aware with who work in cassava in your community, how many go to the cassava fields without their spouse or partner or a male relative? The injunctive version of this question says, do you agree? Or how many people in your community would agree with the statement, it is inappropriate for women who work with cassava to go to cassava fields without their spouse or partner or a male relative? So when we applied the exploratory factor analysis, in both the descriptive and injunctive, 1A and 2A, or I should just say questions 1 and 2, these measured some similar underlying concept, as did questions 4, 5, and 6. So we created 2 indicators from this module, and you'll see them in the dashboard, and you'll see whether they were strong or not. But we have 2 indicators from this dashboard, both in their descriptive and injunctive versions. Next slide, please. Right, so to construct the dashboard, we combine each pair of descriptive and injunctive norm indicators into a single categorical indicator, and you code it like this. There's 3 options, because remember, these are the descriptive and injunctive indicators are binary. Either they're strong or they're not strong, or prevalent or not prevalent. So number 1, you can have neither the descriptive or injunctive norms be prevalent in a community. We'd code that as 0. Secondly, if only one of them is prevalent, we would code that as 1. And finally, if the descriptive and injunctive versions of the same norm are prevalent, or of the same indicator are prevalent, we'd code that as 2. So of course, these reflect how restrictive a norm is within the target agri-food system, ranging from 0 to 2. So if we look at the figure, we've coded 0 as blue. Blue is it's not restrictive in an injunctive or a descriptive sense. The yellow ones are either injunctively or descriptively prevalent, but in practice, these are all descriptively prevalent and not injunctively prevalent. So this is where the mobility and division of labor indicators from the previous slide show up. If you look under that category, we have 2 indicators. Women do not participate in male-dominated agri-food system activities, and women do not engage in the marketing of agricultural products. So these 2 indicators were they were prevalent in the descriptive version of the indicator, but not in the injunctive form of the indicator. And then finally, in red, you see the you see the indicators that were prevalent in both the injunctive and descriptive sense. And now Jessica will talk about sort of what we can do with these results. And I'm going to take a look at this question.
Great, thank you, everyone. So our final step, step 5, is a stakeholder dissemination workshop. I'm gonna see if I can, okay, sorry, I was trying to move some things around on my screen. I wasn't prepared to be the presenter, and so you're just gonna have to tolerate me looking upward to my other screen while I present. Sorry about that. The final step in this process, as we discuss this consultative process, is to share back the findings related to these gender norms with relevant stakeholders. And that process helps increase the understanding of what the normative constraints are, particularly those that impact women in the target agri-food systems. And it also helps to identify the leverage points and levers to inform the design of gender transformative approaches at different institutional levels. So when we say institutional levels, thinking back to that ecological systems approach. So looking at the leverage points and levers is useful for identifying potential entry points and these potential actions that can be considered as a way of reducing normative constraints within agri-food systems. And the starting point for these discussions is this gender norms indicator dashboard that Nate just shared and presented in the previous step. So that initiates a process of, talking through all of these constraints and ways of approaching them. So what are we doing next with this information? The report sort of goes up through step 5, and our continued work is what I'm going to talk about here. So during the stakeholder dissemination workshop, we discuss these points and we bring them up to identify how these different normative constraints can be reduced. And then following these stakeholder dissemination workshops in Tanzania and Nigeria, members of the research team have been meeting with stakeholders with different local NGOs to design specific gender transformative interventions based on the results that have been presented. So what does that process look like? So I'm going to talk through one specific example here, and that is this inequitable norm that is inappropriate for women who work in cassava to own agricultural land. So based on that, it was possible to identify leverage points and levers. So one, for example, at these different levels, at the state level, policies and programs, and a lever would be to encourage governments to implement approaches that specifically target women's access to and control over productive assets such as land. At the community level, raising community awareness through by challenging traditional gender norms and stereotyping and stereotypes and and ideas, challenging these ideas that women shouldn't be holding control over assets such as land. And then at the household level, again, addressing ways of reducing inequalities between men and women regarding ownership of land and other productive assets, and developing ways for one potential lever could be developing ways for men and boys to learn about gender norms and attitudes and develop new attitudes and skills. So from these two specific in the next shade of green here, two specific approaches have been proposed: gender transformative radio programs, and then gender transformative community and group dialogues. And we can then see as we progress through these that these can they can have effects at different levels of the ecological system and lead to shifts in potential outcomes. First stage outcomes would include that there are ideas about solutions for increasing women's ownership of land. At the community level, perceptions of women's land and ownership change, and the community and group members develop action plans to solve women's lack of land ownership, all of these leading to women's ownership of land increasing. And our next phase on our next slide here, this is essentially a much more detailed program, a detailed version of what we considered in the previous slide. So we're looking at, rather than just looking at land, we're also talking about the ability to take out loans and the ability to make decisions about major expenditures. And so similarly, walking through these in great detail across the sociological system, developing specific research-informed interventions that that can serve to act at these different layers within the socio-ecological system, and eventually improving both the immediate outcomes and longer term outcomes that are related directly to the norms that we see on the left-hand side. And finally, if you would like to view this document in greater detail and think about ways that you can apply it, etc., you can download it. You can get the QRL here, or you can also just Google in the CG space. You can either look under CG space for this information, or a Google Scholar, a guide to developing quantitative tools for measuring gender norms in agri-food systems, and that will help you get to this document as well. So thank you all very much, and I turn it back to Ara.
Thank you. Thanks, Jessica, and thanks, team, for the great presentation. Now I'd like to invite Lauren to share her reflections on this work, and perhaps she could share some perspectives on how this work compares to approaches in other work or related sectors. Over to you, Lauren.
Thank you so much. It's really a great pleasure to be here today and to be asked to participate in this webinar. As I was telling the colleagues, many, many years ago, I served as IFPRI's first research analyst for their gender task force, which had started. And the task force was really born of the recognition that the findings and lessons learned from IFPRI's groundbreaking work on intra-household resource allocation needed to be better institutionalized across IFPRI and its partners. So it's really very exciting to see how much that work has evolved and to see that the CGIAR continues to be a leader in gender measurement, as demonstrated by this new guide to develop quantitative tools for measuring gender norms in agri-food systems. So currently, as was noted, I lead the gender statistics portfolio in the Division of Data Analytics, Planning and Monitoring at UNICEF, where in addition to our role as a custodian or co-custodian of 19 SDG indicators, we are also developing new data collection tools to close crucial data gaps on children's well-being. And this includes methodological work we have been undertaking to measure at the population level gender norms related to the distribution of unpaid care and domestic work among children that Emma Saman of ODI and I are leading. Now, UNICEF doesn't do much work in the area of agri-food systems, of course, but I really wish this guide had been available when we commenced our work on measuring gender norms, as so much of the guidance is applicable to the measurement of gender norms across a range of sectors, as the guide itself notes. And I really think it goes a long way towards unpacking or demystifying gender norms. What I mean by that is that the term gender norms is somewhat of a black box that we tend not to use very precisely. For example, often when tools say they are measuring gender norms, they are actually measuring the attitudes a person holds, what the person thinks they should do. So we lack an understanding of the descriptive and injunctive norms that influence that attitude and ultimately one's behavior. I think this is due in part to the absence of robust measures of gender norms and the complexities of operationalizing these concepts in a ways that both allow for standardization so that we can compare across interventions or even countries, but that also allow for contextualized information that program designers can use to inform gender transformative interventions. The guidance talks about how there were really no robust measures of gender norms related to agri-food systems, and we see this problem across many areas. For example, in a review of over 100 measures related to women's economic empowerment, the Emerge project out of University of California at San Diego identified only 9 measures of norms constructs. So out of 100 measures, only 9 actually attempted to measure norms constructs, and most of these only measured attitudes and descriptive norms. And really, in a review of UNICEF's own programs a few years ago, colleagues found that while many programs aim to be gender transformative, to shift gender norms that serve as a barrier to children's well-being, such as those related to immunization coverage, the programs did not actually measure whether these shifts in those norms occurred, and there is really great need for guidance in this area. So one of the aspects of the guidance I really admire the most is the ease in which it provides a framework for both collecting and analyzing data on norms that, while most relevant for agri-food systems, can be applied across the multiple sectors UNICEF works on. I particularly like the application of the social ecological model to the value chain to identify the different levels at which gender norms operate and influence individual behavior. And I can imagine the same tool applied to gender norms associated with children's schooling, such as those held by parents related to the value placed on educating girls, or community level norms dissuading pregnant girls or new young mothers from continuing with their schooling. I think this is an especially useful framework because, as the guidance notes, it allows program designers to identify different points of entry for influencing norms at different levels. Along those lines, I very much liked the analytic approach to and presentation of the indicators in the dashboard, in which norms are assigned a value of least restrictive to most restrictive based on whether neither the injunctive or descriptive norm is present, as we just heard, only the descriptive norm or injunctive norm is prevalent, or both are. This strikes me as very action-oriented information, in other words, that practitioners can understand and act on. But I also wonder if some of the nuance in understanding the strength of different norms is lost in the formulation. And if so, does it matter for designing effective interventions? For example, in the approach the authors use, a norm is strongest if it is perceived to be present both descriptively and injunctively, with presence being defined if the marine response is some or more for the presence of descriptive and injunctive norms. I'm interested in your thinking behind this cutoff and whether there may be meaningful differences in the strength of norms for those reported some people adhere to versus most or all, and whether that additional information can tell practitioners anything important about the stickiness of norms and needed interventions. And relatedly, did you consider measuring sanctions or benefits for defying or complying with norms to get at their strength, or reference groups to understand whose perceptions matter most to respondents? Another aspect of the guidance I quite like is the participatory process for measuring gender norms. I think this is quite important to understand how they may or may not play out in different settings, and relatedly speaks to an issue we grappled with when we first commenced our work on measuring gender norms at the population level. Essentially, we received some pushback that there's little value in doing so in developing standardized measures because norms are so context specific. But I think the process you implement, in which you identify global evidence on norms and use the stakeholder consultations to contextualize their importance to a given agri-food system, nicely illustrates the value in both types of measures. And the call to collect key background information in the questionnaire to enable intersectional analysis of variation in the perception and prevalence of gender norms is quite important. At UNICEF, we are particularly interested in how these vary by age between adolescents and their caregivers, for example. And I know just a couple of minutes left, but if you may, I do have a couple of questions that came to me, and if I could pose to the authors, that would help us inform our own work going forward. I'm curious whether and how you contend with the potential for social desirability bias in norms measurement, or when a respondent may tell an interviewer what she thinks is the socially acceptable response. Is this something that surfaced during the stakeholder consultation workshops and data collection? And if so, how did you deal with it, or would you advise the guidance? How would you advise the guidance users to do so? And then, maybe at a more micro level, how long on average did it take to implement the questionnaire in your pilots? And to what extent do you think these measures could be integrated into existing surveys rather than as standalone surveys in themselves? And finally, I'll conclude by saying, I really do hope that, I know this is part of the process of dissemination, and I really do hope that You've thought about what a robust dissemination plan would look like, because I think there's such value in this guidance. And too often I've been part of or observed the development of guidance that I think doesn't get used as much as it should, because we tend not to invest as much resource or thought into what that dissemination plan looks like. But I really believe that this is a valuable tool, and I encourage you to make sure it gets into the hands of the people who need it. So thank you. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Lauren, for sharing these comments. And I think we all agree that this is such an useful tool. Congratulations to all the co-authors once again. Steve and the team, would you like to start with taking Lauren's question first? And then also you can feel free to just answer any questions you saw from the chat. We've got a lot of questions in the chat, and we have limited time. Yeah, over to you, Steve.
Yeah, and I know there were some questions in and out of Lauren's reflection, so I know I didn't jot them all down. So Lauren, please help me or others on the team to remember those and come up with some responses. Yeah, Davis could probably answer best on the time to take to implement the survey that we ended up developing and piloting in the two focal countries. But it was around an hour, if I remember. And then on socially desirable responses and how you address that, I think that's a tricky issue to deal with any survey instrument. And I think, I don't know if this helped address this issue, but through that kind of participatory process that we took to develop the tool, we also did some cognitive testing along the way. So making sure that the questions made sense to people in the local context, using the Kiswahili version. And so while it doesn't prevent that from happening, I think it just showcased that we did spend a lot of time on making sure that the tool that was being developed was done at the highest level, and how to avoid that. I'd like to hear others what their thoughts are, but getting those responses from people that are that you hope are genuine. I think when you spend a lot of time developing a tool, you try to minimize that the best of your ability. Over to maybe Jessica. Were you able to not note down any other further questions, or Nate or Davis?
Sure. So on the extent that, so going back to the length of the questionnaire, so that length we referred to was like the full pilot. And we suggest here that, some of those questions have been reduced. Other questions we might also think are less of an issue in a particular context. So that could potentially be shorter. And the extent that things can be incorporated into other surveys, yes, we're in the process of doing that. So when the examples that I walked you through on applying the results, these were some specific examples from a local NGO in Tanzania, Kolping, and that is currently focused on some cassava interventions. And so, and then some gender transformative approaches within those cassava interventions. And so we're in the process of initiating a baseline study to examine those changes. So, among many outcomes, we're looking at norms. So that's exciting. And so that's those are sort of the major points that I wanted to bring up in response to Lauren specifically. I don't know. So there are a lot of questions in this chat, and I don't know how we want to prioritize them, Ara, or if we've been able to address some of them in written form.
Right. Yeah, so yeah, we have lots of questions and we have very limited time to tackle all these. So while we can go from the top, I think if presenters, you're all feel free to just try to address some of them directly in the chat. And I think Diana Lopez had a couple of questions. Do you want to come in and ask the questions?
Hi, Ada.
Hi,
Thank
Diana.
you. Yeah, so I think I have two particular questions. And one is that as I see to the questions regarding the injunctive norms, you always refer to people in your community. But we know that when it comes to injunctive norms, the reference group matters. So it may be that it's not people in general. It may be that for me, the reference group is other women, or it's actually, community leaders or religious leaders. So I wondered if you have any thoughts on that, on, how to identify the reference group and somehow pros and cons of framing the questions in a general way, people in your community rather than to a particular reference group. And the second one is that as I see the way that you frame the questions, the answers is like not a continuous variable, let's say, or a continuous answer, but few, some, a lot. Well, I forgot exactly the answer questions. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on somehow pros and cons of framing the questions in this way, rather than the other possible way, which is out of 10 women in your community, how many own a bank account? And how the people in your community, how many of them do you think is appropriate for a woman to own a bank account? So if you can sort of you have any thoughts on that? Thank you.
Yeah, and I would maybe come in first the reference group that we used depended on the respondent being interviewed. So at that more community level, when we were especially talking with producers, and those same producers might also process or trade in a particular commodity, in this case cassava, fish, or chicken. Then the reference group was community. But as Nate showed in his examples, it depended then if you were talking, say, to extension workers, then we asked them, or NGO workers, kind of the supporters, of different actors within these agri-food systems. Then we asked them, about the women who you support or who you work with. So it was always very specific depending on the respondent type we were interviewing. And then I maybe I'll also ask others to come in here on the use of say a Likert scale, which we used, versus out of 10 women in the example that you gave, Diana. I think we chose the Likert scale because it's a little bit more simple, fewer kind of responses to get people's head around, versus asking them to come up with a number out of 10 and how meaningful that is. In other instruments, we've used beans to try to understand, say, percentages or 0 n. But here it was felt that these Likert responses people could easily understand. And again, through that cognitive testing that we did prior to piloting the tool, it worked out quite well.
Thanks. Yeah, go ahead, Jessica.
Yeah, I'll just say, so yes, Deanna, like, I don't think that there's necessarily a, anyone has done a paper comparing, like if these different approaches of like of a 5 category Likert scale versus a 10-point how many scale, like if there's a bias that arises one way or another from those 2 approaches, I don't know that that necessarily exists. However, from our experiences, like one, like if you look across the norms literature, this approach of many, few, all, none, etc., are that those approaches are more common. And from our experiences in general, that like the more questions we have, the more potential points one can select across a scale. So we like that from a statistical point of view, because it leads us to more likely to have like a normal distribution of our normal distribution across these responses. But we don't necessarily, it's much more difficult for people to respond to typically these greater numbers. So yeah, and Lauren's actually pointing to that same point here in a chat response, and saying that how many of your neighbors, or out of 10, how many didn't perform well with respondents in cognitive interviewing. So that's what we've seen across a variety of things as well. It's just more difficult for people to conceptualize how they're supposed to respond, and then identify like, oh, does 6 versus 7 even make a difference? How many would it be? So it adds to respondent burden. And then I just want to highlight Betsy's response related to social desirability. Betsy is one of the co-authors on this work, and really is the one who brought a lot of expertise on norms to this project. So I just want to highlight her response in the chat for those who don't have it pulled up. And she has said that the norms questions are less susceptible to bias to the extent that you then take your own, the own ego or I out of it, and respondents are no longer reporting about their own behavior. So I'm not saying, oh, I think this, in order to provide a positive impression to my interviewer, but these questions are instead about the larger, like the community at large, and making it less susceptible to social desirability bias, theoretically. So I just wanted to highlight that insightful response.
Thank you.
Anyone else want to jump in?
I think we have time to just maybe answer one more question. I don't know, Kathy, are you still here? You can just quickly jump in and then ask any burning question you have. I see a couple of comments from you in the chat. Are you here, Kathy? Maybe she's not available. And hello?
Yes, sorry.
Yes. Were you muted? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just interested. Sorry, I love the presentation and everything. I just want to reinforce that. Amazing. Really great. It's just that we so often talk about harmful gender norms, and of course they exist. But I'm intrigued by the thought that there are many positive gender norms. For example, women often transmit a knowledge to their daughters, say on particular types of seed and plants to grow and that kind of thing. Different groundnut varieties and so on. And it seems to me it would be an idea to also look at, identify and build on these positive gender norms, because that also is a point of leverage. And these norms are often in danger of being extinguished, really, because we're not paying much attention to them. It's just a thought I wanted to add.
Okay, thank you, Kathy. So I think our time is almost up. So as I think somebody asked if we could share the PowerPoint of the webinar, and Steve said it's fine, so I can share the recording and the PowerPoint afterward. And thanks once again to the presenters and Lauren for your the excellent work and then the great comments and reflections that you shared today. As mentioned earlier, Engendering Data features both blogs and webinars throughout the year. So if you'd like to publish a blog or do a webinar with us, this seems like a good fit for your project, please do reach out to us. And thank you once again for everyone for participating. And yeah, have a great rest of the day. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Everyone, especially Lauren.
Bye.
Thanks so much for your comments.
Yeah,
Thank you, Lauren.
for being able
Yes.
to
Very
join us.
fun.
I appreciate it.
Thank
Thanks,
you. Send my
Lauren.
regards to Ruth and Agnes and
Yeah,
and
Yes.
the
definitely.
others.
Yeah. I think they're
Take
both
care.
in another meeting right now, but we'll pass it along. Thank you.